The champagne hit my dress before the toast even finished, and the laughter that followed was worse than the wine. I stood there in the middle of the Hale family ballroom, with Pinot fizzing down the front of a dress I'd rented for $110, watching my ex-girlfriend's aunt set her empty glass down on a passing tray, like she'd merely misplaced it instead of aimed it. 200 people in silk and tailored linen turned to look. Somewhere behind me, a string quartet kept playing, because nothing in that room ever stopped for anyone who wasn't paying for the orchestra. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 27 years old, an Omega, and I did other people's books for a living, invoices, receivables, the small, tired arithmetic of small, tired businesses, because 2 years earlier, the accounting firm that trained me had decided the truth I'd found in a client's ledger was less convenient than my employment. I had come to Josephine Hale's engagement party to prove I was fine. I was not fine. I was standing in a ballroom with wine on my collarbone and my dead father's pen in my clutch, the only expensive thing I owned, and I was already regretting every choice that had brought me through that door. Subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because the woman who was about to walk into that ballroom had no idea yet that she was about to change my whole life. The pen had been my father's. Brass and black onyx, his initials worn almost smooth where his thumb used to rest. Mine underneath, where I'd had it re-engraved after he died. I'd carried it into every job interview since I was 22. I touched it now through the fabric of my clutch the way other people touch rosaries, and Josephine's aunt, Constance, sharp-chinned, dressed like she'd stepped out of a decade nobody missed, smiled at me like she'd done me a favor. "Oh, Wren," she said, not lowering her voice at all, still bringing that silly old pen everywhere. "Some things really don't change." I didn't answer. I had learned, in 2 years of being quietly erased from rooms like this one, that answering only fed it. I excused myself toward the terrace doors instead, chin up, dress ruined, and that was when the room changed temperature. I felt her before I saw her. That was the strange part I would spend months trying to explain to my best friend, Nadia, and never quite managing, that the air in that ballroom actually shifted, warm gold light suddenly edged in something colder, like a window had been left open onto November. Iron and burnt cardamom. That was the first thing I ever knew about Cassia Voss, before I knew her name, before I knew what she owned or who she'd buried. The smell of her cut through 200 people's perfume like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned again, and this time it wasn't for me. She was tall in the specific way that made tall women in heels look like children playing dress up beside her, dark hair pulled back hard enough to be a statement, a suit the color of wet slate that had clearly never once brushed against a department store rack. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Waiters adjusted their trays as she passed them, not because she asked, but because some part of every person in that room recognized, on instinct, an apex predator walking calmly through prey. "The Iron Widow," someone murmured behind me, half reverent, half afraid. "I heard she doesn't come to these things anymore." I didn't know yet that the Iron Widow of Voss Maritime was Josephine's older sister. I didn't know that 3 years ago she'd buried a wife and, along with her, whatever softness the tabloids claimed she'd once had. I only knew that she crossed that ballroom like weather, and that when her eyes swept the crowd once, briefly, they caught on the ruined front of my dress and did not immediately look away. Then Josephine's voice rose over the quartet, high and bright and cruel in the specific way only someone who used to love you can be cruel, and the moment broke. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," Josephine called from the small stage near the auction board. Rourke's arm looped through hers like a trophy he'd already won. "Before the auction, I just want to say, some of you know my history isn't exactly spotless. Laughter, warm, indulgent, her eyes found me across the room, and something in them sharpened. Let's just say I've learned the difference between someone who's steady and someone who's actually going somewhere. The laughter this time had my name in it, even though she never said it. I felt my face go hot, felt every eye in that ballroom weigh me and find me wanting, felt the old shape of being unwanted settle back over my shoulders like a coat I'd never actually managed to give away. I turned to leave. I had made it 3 steps toward the terrace doors when the auctioneer's assistant, flustered, announced the wrong final bid on the evening's marquee item, a week at the Hale family's lake house, donated to the Hale Foundation, the charity Josephine's late mother had built her whole legacy around, and read out a number $400,000 higher than what the room had actually offered. Nobody else caught it. 200 people in a room built entirely on money didn't catch a 6-figure error in real time, because they weren't listening to numbers, they were listening to each other. I was listening to the numbers. I had spent my whole life listening to numbers, because numbers didn't laugh at you and numbers didn't leave. That's wrong, I said, and my voice came out clearer and steadier than I felt. The paddle raises stopped at 140. Not 540. Someone added a bid that was never called. The room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when it realizes it's about to watch something interesting happen to someone else. The auctioneer's assistant paled. Rourke's jaw tightened just slightly, just enough that I saw it and nobody else seemed to. Josephine looked at me like I'd grown a second head in the middle of her party, and across the ballroom, Cassia Voss went very, very still and looked at me the way you look at a lock that has just unexpectedly clicked open. She started walking toward me. Nobody corrected the auctioneer's assistant. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that I was wrong, because I wasn't, but that a room full of powerful people would rather let $400,000 evaporate quietly than admit a guest in a wine-stained dress had caught what they hadn't. "Recheck the paddle log," Cassia said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The auctioneer's assistant scrambled for the tablet like Cassia's words carried their own gravity, and 30 seconds later, red-faced, he confirmed it. The final bid had been keyed in wrong. A typo, a stray 0, and the true number was exactly what I'd said. A murmur went through the crowd. That specific society murmur that meant a story had just been born and would be retold at brunch for weeks. Josephine's smile had gone brittle at the edges. Rourke had recovered his easy charm, but I'd seen the flicker underneath it, and something in me, the part that used to comb through client statements looking for the one number that didn't belong, filed it away without meaning to. Cassia reached me before I'd decided whether to run or stay. Up close, the cold in her eyes wasn't quite what I'd expected from across the room. It looked less like ice and more like a door someone had shut a long time ago and never gotten around to reopening. "You caught that in your head," she said. Not a question. "I count things," I said. "It's a bad habit at parties. It's a useful one everywhere else." She glanced once at the wine stain on my dress, at Constance still smirking near the bar, at the general architecture of my humiliation, and something in her jaw set. Everyone else in this room missed it. I didn't. It was such a strange thing to say out loud, so plainly, that I didn't have a response ready. I felt the words land somewhere under my ribs anyway, the way you feel a hand catch you before you know you were falling. "Wren Calloway," I said, because it seemed important that she have my name and not just the shape of my evening's disaster. "Cassia Voss." She said it like a fact, not an introduction, the way people say things they've stopped expecting anyone not to already know. Then, watching my face for the recognition that didn't come, Something in her expression eased by 1 degree. "You don't know who I am. I know you're the reason the room got quiet twice tonight," I said. "Once for you walking in. Once for you being the only person who backed me up." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. It didn't reach the rest of her. "Walk with me, away from the wine, before someone throws more of it." I should have said no. I would tell Nadia later that I genuinely, actively considered saying no, weighing the last shreds of my dignity against the very real possibility that I was about to become party gossip in an entirely new way. The ex who got claimed by the sister, wasn't that a story? But the thing was, nobody had looked at me like I mattered in 2 years, and this woman had crossed a ballroom for it. "Okay," I said. She didn't take my arm. She didn't touch me at all, not yet, but she matched her stride to mine, which for a woman that tall was its own kind of courtesy, and steered us both toward the terrace doors, with a look that made the crowd part like she'd asked it to. Josephine caught my eye once as we passed. I couldn't read her expression. I decided I didn't need to. Outside, the night air was cool enough to raise gooseflesh on my wine-damp collarbone, and the noise of the party dimmed to a low gold hum behind glass. Cassia stopped at the terrace railing and looked out over the dark garden like she was looking for something specific in it and had given up finding it years ago. "My sister has a talent for making people feel small," she said. "She's had a great deal of practice. She's good at it," I agreed, before I could stop myself. "You dated her. It wasn't a guess." 18 months, I think. "My mother mentioned you before she died. Said you were the first person Josephine brought home who actually balanced her checkbook instead of just spending against it." I laughed, sharp and surprised, and some of the party's residue cracked off me. That's the nicest thing anyone in this family has ever said about me. That's a low bar. Cassia turned to look at me fully then, and up close her eyes were the gray of harbor water before a storm, steady, assessing, not unkind. "I own a shipping company that does $40 million a quarter in freight nobody in that room could tell you the first thing about. I have people paid specifically to catch errors like the one you just caught, and half of them would have missed it." A pause. "I'm going to say something forward, and you're free to tell me to stop." My pulse did something complicated. "Say it. I'd like to buy you a coffee that isn't at this party. Tomorrow, if you're free. Not because you're my sister's ex." Her gaze didn't waver. "Because you're the only person in that entire ballroom who told the truth tonight, and I find I would very much like to know what else you're right about." Behind us, through the glass, I could see Josephine watching us with an expression I finally recognized. Not jealousy, not yet, but the particular unease of someone realizing a piece has moved on a board they thought they controlled. "Yes," I said, before I'd fully decided to. "Coffee, tomorrow." Cassia nodded once, like a deal closed, and reached into her jacket, producing a card with nothing on it but a phone number in a severe, exact hand. Her fingers brushed mine as she passed it over, deliberate, brief, gone again, and even that small contact sent something warm and startling up through my wrist. "Text me your address," she said. "I'll send a car. Not because you can't manage a cab, Wren Calloway. Because I'd like an excuse to see where you live." Behind the terrace doors, the auctioneer announced the corrected bid, and the crowd's applause washed out into the night, small and distant, and, for the first time all evening, none of it aimed at me. The car Cassia sent the next afternoon was the kind of black sedan that made my apartment building's ancient buzzer system look even more like it belonged in a museum. And the driver, a beta named Otto, who called me Miss Calloway like it was a title I'd earned instead of one that embarrassed me, didn't blink at the crack in my building's front step or the mail slot someone had jammed a takeout menu into weeks ago and never cleared. Harrow House sat on a bluff 20 minutes outside the city, gray stone against gray water, the kind of place that had clearly been built to be looked at from below. Cassia met me at the door herself, no assistant hovering, sleeves rolled to the elbow like she'd been in the middle of something before I arrived. "You cook," I said, surprised, catching the smell of rosemary drifting from somewhere behind her, and under it, that same iron and burnt cardamom, warmer now, less armored than it had been at the party. "Badly," she admitted. "Mrs. Frost usually handles the kitchen. She's visiting her sister this week, so you get whatever I can manage, which today is soup and an apology in advance." The house was enormous in the way that made my studio apartment feel like a coat closet, but it wasn't cold the way I expected wealth like this to be. There were books stacked too deep on shelves that clearly hadn't been arranged by a decorator. There was a framed photograph on the mantel of a woman with laughing dark eyes that I didn't ask about, not yet, though I felt Kasaya's gaze flick to it and away, quick as a held breath. "You run a shipping empire out of this house," I said, when we'd settled at a kitchen table older than either of us, bowls of soup that were, in fact, slightly too salty between us. "I run it from an office downtown that I hate," Cassia said. "I think here, when I let myself." Voss Maritime handles freight and logistics across 9 ports. My late wife's family built it. I inherited it when she died, along with a board of directors who've spent 3 years waiting for me to fail so they can replace me with someone who smiles more at shareholders. She said it flatly, like a fact she'd worn smooth through repetition, but I heard the fracture underneath it anyway, the particular careful flatness of someone who has learned that grief, spoken too loudly, invites other people's discomfort more than their comfort. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was true, and because I didn't know yet what else was safe to say. "Don't be." It was 3 years ago. A pause, her thumb tracing the rim of her bowl, a small, unconscious gesture I would come to recognize as the closest thing she had to fidgeting. "I didn't bring you here to talk about Marisol. Why did you bring me here?" "Because I looked at 3 years of Voss Maritime's Port Authority filings last month, and something in them doesn't add up, and every accountant on my payroll tells me they're clean." She met my eyes. And because the only person I've met in 3 years who caught an error nobody else in the room could see was standing in my sister's ballroom in a ruined dress, and I have never in my life been able to walk away from a mystery. "Show me," I said. She did. Hours passed. She spread ledgers across that kitchen table like other people spread out old photographs, and I fell into the numbers the way I always had, the world narrowing down to columns and dates and the small silent tell of a transaction that didn't belong. At some point, her hand brushed mine, reaching for the same page, and I felt her go still beside me, felt the air between us change temperature again, softer this time, warmer. "Your pulse just changed," she said quietly. Alphas could read that, sometimes, in an omega close enough. "I can hear it." "So can I admitted, and I didn't mean my own." She didn't move closer. She didn't have to. The space between us had already gotten smaller than either of us had planned. "Tell me to stop, and I will," she said, low, careful, her eyes on mine and nowhere else. "I mean that. Say the word, and I put 6 feet back between us, and we go back to the ledgers." "Don't stop," I said, and it came out steadier than I felt. She lifted her hand, slow, giving me every chance to change my mind, and brushed a strand of hair back from my face, her fingers grazing my jaw, no further, nothing claimed, just contact, held a moment too long to be accidental. Toasted sugar and fresh paper, my own scent, I would learn later, warming the kitchen the way hers had warmed the ballroom. And something in her expression when she caught it made her look, for one unguarded second, young. I have a board meeting Thursday, she said, not moving away. I'd like you there. As my auditor. On the record, paid. Above board, I don't do anything else. A beat. And because I think whatever's wrong in these filings, you'll find it before anyone else does. My phone buzzed against the table between us before I could answer. A text from a number I didn't recognize, no name attached, 3 words long. Ask her about Rourke. I looked up at Cassia, the warmth of a moment ago gone cold and strange in my chest. Do you know anyone named Rourke? Something shifted behind her eyes, careful and fast, like a door closing on a room she didn't want me to see yet. My sister's fiancé, she said slowly. Why? I turned my phone around so she could read it and watched the last of the softness leave her face, replaced by something harder, older, more familiar to the woman who'd walked through that ballroom like weather. Show me the filings from the Westport terminal, she said. Now. We found it at 11:52 p.m., 3 days later, in a subcontractor account buried 4 layers deep in Voss Maritime's Western Terminal filings. And I know the exact time because I looked at the clock the second the number stopped making sense. There, I said, tapping the screen where 2 shipping manifests, filed 6 weeks apart, listed the exact same container numbers with wildly different declared values. This isn't an accounting error. Nobody makes this mistake by accident. Somebody's laundering cargo insurance claims through a Shell subcontractor, and the Shell company's registered agent, I scrolled, my stomach dropping as the name resolved on the screen, is Rourke Adler. Cassia went very quiet, the specific quiet of someone doing math with much higher stakes than a spreadsheet. My sister's fiancé is stealing from my company. Not just stealing. I pulled the thread further, the way I used to before Franklin Doyle taught me that pulling threads too far could cost you everything. Look at the dates. These payouts started 14 months ago, right around when the Hale Foundation's endowment took an unexplained hit that got quietly written off as market losses. He's running the same scheme through 2 accounts, your company, your family's charity. I looked up at her. He's not marrying your sister for love, Cassia. He's marrying into cover. How do you know the foundation's numbers? She asked, sharp, and for one terrible second I thought she suspected me of something, thought the old fear, the fear that had lived under my skin since the day Franklin Doyle smiled at me and said nobody would ever hire an accountant who couldn't keep her mouth shut, was about to prove itself true again. Because 2 years ago, I found this exact pattern at my old firm, I said. And the words came out rougher than I meant them to. A client was running fraud through a subcontractor shell, almost identical structure, and I built the whole file. My boss took one look at it, told me the client was worth too much to lose, and fired me for insubordination when I refused to bury it. My hands weren't quite steady. I never got to prove I was right. I've been doing tax returns in a strip mall for 2 years because Franklin Doyle decided the truth was bad for business. Cassia's expression didn't soften into pity, which I was grateful for, because pity was the one thing I couldn't have survived that night. It hardened instead, the harbor storm gray of her eyes going flat and dangerous. What was the client's name, she said. 2 years ago, I told her. I watched her go still in a completely different way, watched her pull up something on her own phone with hands that were, for the first time since I'd met her, not entirely steady. That's the holding company that owns half of Rourke Adler's shell structure, she said quietly. You found this once already, 2 years ago. Alone, with no resources, and they buried you for it. Yes, they won't bury it this time. She looked at me, and something in her face had rearranged itself entirely, The cold banked down under something that looked terrifyingly like resolve wrapped around tenderness. I need you to build the file again. Properly, everything, and I need you to understand what that means before you agree. Rourke Adler is 2 weeks from marrying into my family. If we're right, he has resources and lawyers, and he will not go quietly. I know what it means, I said. I've done it before. You did it before, and it cost you your career. Her jaw tightened. This time it won't. I'll make sure of that personally, whatever it takes. But I need to hear you say yes with your eyes open. I thought about Franklin Doyle's office, the particular smug patience in his voice as he explained that some clients were worth protecting. I thought about Constance's wineglass and Josephine's toast, and every small, quiet way this family and people like it had decided I didn't matter enough to tell the truth to. Yes, I said. Cassia reached across the table and closed her hand over mine, not asking this time, but not taking either. Just there, warm and solid and steady. Then we start tonight, she said. And Ren, when this is over, whatever happens with my sister's wedding, I want you to know I didn't bring you into my house to use what you know. I brought you into my house because the first time I ever heard you speak, you told 200 people the truth when it cost you nothing to stay quiet. Her thumb moved once over my knuckles. I have spent 3 years surrounded by people who lie to my face for a living. I am not interested in spending one more night pretending I don't want to know every true thing you're capable of finding. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere out over the water, low and distant, the first warning of the storm that would trap us both inside Harrow House 2 nights later, with nowhere left to run from what we'd started. The storm hit on a Thursday, and it took the coastal power grid down with it sometime around 9, plunging Harrow House into candlelight and the deep hush of a building meant for more people than the 2 of us currently occupying it. Priya Okafor, Kasaya's chief operating officer, had come out to review the fraud file in person and gotten stranded along with everyone else when the roads flooded. Which meant the 3 of us spent that first hour by the fire arguing over subpoena strategy like it was the most natural thing in the world. I still don't like it, Priya said, watching me over the rim of her coffee with the frank, unhurried suspicion of a woman who had clearly seen strangers walk into Kasaya's orbit before and hadn't liked how those stories ended. You show up 2 weeks ago and suddenly we're staring down a fraud case that could take out half the board. I show up because your fraud case was already sitting in your filings, I said, not unkindly. I just know how to read them. In 15 years, Priya said slowly, watching Cassia rather than me, I have never once seen her cancel a board call to sit at a kitchen table with a stranger. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It landed more like a verdict, delivered with the particular weight of someone changing her mind out loud. Cassia didn't answer that. She only reached over, without looking, and topped up my coffee, a small domestic gesture that made Priya's eyebrows climb even further. By midnight, Priya had gone to bed in one of the house's dozen guest rooms, and the storm outside had settled into a steady, relentless drumming against glass that made the whole house feel like the inside of a held breath. I found Cassia on the second-floor balcony despite the weather, sheltered under the eave, watching lightning fork out over black water. You should be inside, I said. I like storms, she said. Marisol used to hate them. I used to stand out here just to prove I wasn't afraid of anything, and she used to yell at me through the glass to come back in. A small, unpracticed smile. I miss being yelled at like that. It's strange, the things you miss. I came to stand beside her instead of retreating, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, close enough that her scent, iron and cardamom warm now instead of armored, wrapped around me under the roar of the rain. My skin had felt too tight all evening. my temperature running high in a way I'd been ignoring since dinner, and it was the lightning that finally made me admit to myself what was actually happening. The particular restless heat gathering low and insistent under my ribs 3 weeks earlier than my suppressants should have let it come. "Cassia," I said, and my voice came out different than I meant it to. "I think my heat's starting." She went very still beside me. When she turned, her pupils had blown wide, the alpha in her responding before the rest of her caught up, but she didn't move closer. She planted her feet exactly where they were and kept both hands visibly at her sides, like she was proving something to herself as much as to me. "Okay," she said, low and careful. "Tell me what you need. Tell me and I'll get it, or I'll leave, whichever you want. I mean that, Ren. Say the word and I'm gone from this hallway in 10 seconds. I don't want you gone." The rain roared. My pulse roared louder. "I want you to stay." I stopped, made myself say the true thing instead of the easy thing. "I've never done this with someone I actually trusted." "Then we go slow," Cassia said, "and you tell me to stop the second any part of you means it, and I will stop, even if it kills me." She lifted one hand, not to touch me yet, just to hold it in the space between us, offering, "Ask me with your words, Ren. Tell me what you want, and I'll give you exactly that and nothing more." "Kiss me," I said. "Just that. Start there." She closed the distance slowly enough that I could have stopped it at any point, slowly enough that by the time her mouth finally found mine, I was the one who closed the last inch, both of us soaked from the rain blowing sideways under the eave, her hand coming up to cradle my jaw like I was something that might break, and something she intended to keep unbroken. The kiss was careful first, and then it wasn't, and somewhere in it I felt the restless heat under my skin ease into something less like panic and more like coming home. She pulled back first, breathing hard, her forehead resting against mine. "That's as far as we go tonight," she said. "Heat consent isn't consent I take at midnight during a storm, no matter how much either of us wants otherwise. When this happens for real, it happens when you're steady and sure and not running 101 fever, and I will be the one insisting on that even when you argue with me. Understood?" I laughed, unsteady, grateful, more in love with her in that single moment of refusal than I'd been in the whole reckless slide toward it. Understood. Behind us, thunder cracked directly overhead, and somewhere down the hall Priya's door opened, her voice sharp with alarm. "Cassia, you need to see this. Someone just leaked the Port Authority filings to the press, and they've cut the story so it looks like Ren built the fraud, not caught it." The scars came out over the next 3 days, once the storm passed and my heat with it, in the unhurried way scars surface between two people no longer performing for anyone else. Cassia showed me the ones on her forearm first, old, thin, pale against her skin, and told me, flatly, that her mother had believed pain built discipline. That Cassia had learned to run a shipping empire by learning first not to flinch when her mother's doctrine was applied by hand instead of by lecture. "Control is strength," she said, staring into the fire instead of at me. That's what she taught Josephine and me both, since we were children. Love makes you soft, and soft things get taken from you. She believed it so completely that when I married Marisol anyway, she didn't come to the wedding. A long pause. When Marisol died, an aneurysm, nothing anyone could have stopped. Not fraud, not violence, just a body that failed her at 34. My mother told me it was proof that I'd let myself be soft, and the universe had collected on the debt. "That's not proof of anything," I said. "That's just cruelty wearing a philosophy. I know that now. She looked at me then, something raw and unguarded in her face that I understood. Instinctively, she showed almost no one. It took me 3 years and a woman with a dead father's pen in her clutch to understand that control was never the strength I thought it was. It was just the wall I built so nothing could get close enough to leave again. Her hand found mine on the couch between us. You get close anyway. I don't know how to stop that, and for the first time in 3 years, I don't want to. I told her about my father then, the accountant who'd taught me to read a ledger the way other fathers teach their kids to read a map, who died when I was 19, whose pen I still carried, because it was the last thing he'd handed me with his own 2 hands, and told me, don't ever let anyone tell you the numbers are wrong when you know they're right. I told her about the sister I'd paid through nursing school with the last of my savings the year Franklin Doyle fired me, the 6 months I'd eaten rice and eggs so my sister wouldn't have to drop out. You gave up your career for her, Cassia said. I'd do it again tomorrow. I turned my father's pen over in my fingers, an old habit, and caught Cassia watching the motion with an expression I couldn't quite read. 2 days later, she handed me a small box, unwrapped, no ribbon, the kind of gift that had clearly not come from an assistant. Inside was a fountain pen, not identical to my father's, but close in weight and balance, brass fittings, a nib she'd apparently had specially ground to match my handwriting after quietly borrowing 3 of my old audit notes to send to a specialist. You mentioned once you were always afraid of losing it, she said, almost gruff, the closest I'd yet seen her come to shy. I'm not trying to replace it. I just thought you should have a second one. For when you're afraid to carry the only one you have into a room like Franklin Doyle's. I didn't have words for a long moment, and when I finally found them, they came out thick. Nobody's ever noticed anything like that about me before. Everyone else in every room you've ever walked into missed it, Cassia said, low. Echoing the words she'd first said to me across a ballroom, and this time the words landed with the full weight of everything they'd grown into since. I didn't. I never will. We were still sitting there, her hand in my hair, the fire burning low, when Priya knocked twice, hard, and came in without waiting for an answer, her face white. They've arrested Wren, she said. The Financial Crimes Unit, Rourke's lawyers, filed a complaint an hour ago, naming her as the architect of the fraud. There's a warrant. It's already executed. Her eyes cut to me, apologetic and urgent both. Wren, I'm sorry, they're already outside. They took me in a car with no lights or sirens, which somehow made it worse, like even my arrest wasn't important enough to announce. I spent that night and the next day in a holding cell that smelled like bleach and old coffee, my phone confiscated, my father's pen, thank God, still zipped in my coat pocket where they hadn't thought to look, and Cassia's face, when they finally let her 15 minutes with me through reinforced glass, colder than I had ever seen it. I've got you the best defense attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, she said, her voice clipped, controlled. The mask I'd watched her wear at that first party fully back in place. You'll be out on bail within hours. I need you to trust me on the rest. The rest? I pressed my palm against the glass, an old instinct, useless here. Cassia, what does handling it quietly mean? Priya used that phrase. I don't like that phrase. It means my legal team is negotiating directly with the board and with Rourke's counsel to make this go away without a public trial that could tank Voss Maritime's stock and hand my mother's doctrine everything it ever wanted to say about me. She said it fast, flat, like reciting numbers instead of feelings. It means I need you to sit tight and let the machinery work. You mean you're going to let them believe I did it? I said slowly, so the company's numbers hold. Something flickered across her face, guilt, maybe, or fear dressed up as strategy, and it was answer enough. That's not, she started. Don't, I said. And my voice cracked in a way I hated. Don't stand there behind glass and tell me this is different from every other time someone decided the truth was bad for business. I have done this before, Cassia. I know exactly what it looks like when someone I trusted decides I'm the cost worth paying. I am trying to protect you. You're trying to protect the company, I said. And I understand why. I do, but I need you to hear me say this once, clearly. I would rather burn for the truth than be quietly saved by a lie, and if that's not something you can build a life around, then you should have told me that in the ballroom. Before any of this, before I let myself believe the words in your mouth. The guard called time. Cassia stood on the other side of that glass, with her hand pressed flat against it, mirroring mine, and for one terrible moment, I thought she was going to walk away without answering. I heard you, she said instead, quiet, and something in her voice had gone raw underneath the control. I heard you, Ren. Give me one more day. They let her out. I sat alone in that cell with my father's pen zipped against my ribs and the worst image of my whole life playing on a loop behind my eyes. Cassia's hand on glass, walking away, choosing the Empire over me exactly the way I had always, quietly, terribly, expected someone eventually would. I built the file from a cell with a golf pencil and the back of 3 legal forms because nobody had ever managed to take the numbers out of my head, and numbers, unlike people, had never once let me down. I reconstructed everything from memory, the shell subcontractor, the mirrored container manifests, the foundation's quiet write-off, the dates that lined up like teeth in a lock, and when my public defender came for her mandated 15 minutes, I handed her 3 pages of cramped handwriting and told her, please, get this to Priya Okafor at Voss Maritime, and no one else, and tell her the West Terminal Ledgers, page 4, 3rd column from the left. I don't know exactly what happened in the 18 hours after that. I know Priya took my notes and matched them against the master files in an all-night session that ended with her calling 3 federal auditors she'd known since business school. I know Cassia spent that same night not sleeping, tearing through Rourke Adler's shell structure with a fury Priya later described to me as the most alive she'd seen her in 3 years. Building a case airtight enough that even his lawyers couldn't argue their way around it. I know that by the time they released me the next afternoon, blinking into daylight in yesterday's rented dress, Cassia was standing at the courthouse steps waiting, and she did not say a single word before crossing the distance between us and pulling me into her arms hard enough that I felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely, wholly safe. I'm sorry, she said into my hair. I chose wrong, for one day, out of fear, and you were right to call it what it was. It will not happen again. I promise you that with everything I have left to promise with. We didn't get to stay in that relief for long. Rourke found us within the hour, not by accident, I would learn later, but because Josephine, panicked and finally suspicious, had told him where the courthouse release would happen, not knowing what she was handing him. He came across the plaza fast, his charm gone entirely, replaced by the flat, desperate calculation of a man who understood the walls closing in. You should have stayed quiet, he said to me, low, ugly, his hand closing hard around my arm before I registered he'd moved. You couldn't just take the money and disappear like a normal person. Cassia moved faster than I'd ever seen a person move. She had his wrist twisted off my arm and his back against the courthouse's stone facade before I'd finished flinching, her forearm hard against his throat, and for one long, terrible second I watched something in her face that I recognized from every story anyone had ever told me about the Iron Widow, something capable of ending a person and not looking back. Cassia, I said. Don't. He's not worth what it would cost you. She held there a moment longer, breathing hard, and then, slowly, deliberately, she let him go, stepped back, and looked at him with a contempt colder than anything violence could have carried. "You're not worth my hands," she said. "You're worth a courtroom, and a very long time to think about what you cost yourself." She turned to the two federal agents already crossing the plaza, badges out, having clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. "He's all yours." Rourke Adler didn't run. He didn't have anywhere left to run to. As they cuffed him, he looked at me with something that might, in another life, have been an apology, and said only, "The foundation money was supposed to cover the shortfall before the wedding. I would have paid it all back." "You never would have," I said. "That's the whole story, isn't it? You never intended to." They took him away. Cassia's hand found mine, steady now, warm, and neither of us said anything else until the plaza had gone quiet around us, until the only sound left was the wind and, somewhere behind us, Josephine's voice, breaking, calling my name. The press conference was held 5 days later on the front steps of the Hale Foundation, and every person who had ever sneered at me in that ballroom found a reason to attend. Priya read the findings first, the mirrored manifests, the Shell subcontractor, 14 months of siphoned freight insurance and $250,000 bled from a dead woman's charity, while Rourke Adler's mugshot sat blown up on an easel beside her like a headstone. Then, Cassia stepped up to the podium, and the crowd that had once called her the Iron Widow in hushed, fearful tones went silent for an entirely different reason. 2 years ago, a fraud almost identical to this one was uncovered by an accountant at a small firm downtown, Cassia said, her voice carrying without a microphone's help. She was fired for it. Her employer decided the truth was worth less than a client's business. I would like everyone here to know his name, since he's declined to attend today's proceedings. Franklin Doyle, whose firm's license is currently under state review, precisely because he chose, twice now, to bury what Wren Calloway found. A pause, her eyes finding mine in the crowd. The Hale Foundation and Voss Maritime owe this woman a debt we intend to spend a very long time repaying. The crowd's murmur this time held no cruelty in it at all. I watched Constance, near the back, go pale and quietly excuse herself before the applause even started, the first domino of a social exile that would, over the following months, strip her from every board and guest list she'd ever taken for granted. Josephine found me afterward, off to the side of the crowd, her engagement ring already gone from her hand. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to make big enough," she said. "I spent 18 months with you and never once looked hard enough to see what you actually were. And then I spent a year with a man who was stealing from my mother's legacy, and I still didn't see it because I never learned how to look past what people wanted me to see." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Wren, for all of it." "I know," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I meant the forgiveness underneath it. "You get to be better than that now. Start there." Cassia found me as the crowd thinned, the last of the cameras packing away, and drew me gently around the side of the building, where the noise dropped to almost nothing. "I have one more thing to say, and I'd like to say it properly, without a podium." She took both my hands in hers. The Iron Widow they used to call me, I earned it. 3 years of a wall nobody could climb, built out of grief and my mother's doctrine, and every lesson that told me love was the price you paid for weakness. You climbed it anyway, in a wine-stained dress, with a dead man's pen in your clutch, catching a mistake nobody else in the room was brave enough to name. Her voice roughened. "I love you. Not because you're steady, though you are. Not because you're brilliant, though you are that too. Because you have never once, in the whole time I've known you, been afraid to say the true thing out loud, and I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who were. I love you too, I said, and it came out steady, certain, the truest number I'd ever added up. Ask me with your words, Cassia, whatever you're about to ask. Will you let me claim you? She said. Low, careful, one hand rising to rest, not yet closing, against the curve of my throat. Bond, Mark, all of it, not tonight, not rushed, whenever you're ready and steady and sure, the way you deserve. But I am asking plainly for the rest of both our lives. Yes, I said. Yes, all of it. Ask me properly when the moment's right, and I'll say it again. She kissed me there in the shadow of a building we'd just watched come apart and rebuild itself in the same afternoon. And when? 3 weeks later, in the quiet of Harrow House with no cameras and no crowd, she finally asked, with her teeth grazing gently at my scent gland and her breath unsteady against my ear, "Tell me to stop." And I will, I told her. For the last time in that particular way, don't stop. And the bond snapped into place between us like a lock finally, rightly, closing. 6 months later, Harrow House smelled like rosemary and printer ink in equal measure, because I'd finally moved my whole ledger practice into the sunroom Cassia insisted on converting, and because Mrs. Frost had never once, in 6 months, managed to make soup that wasn't slightly too salty, and none of us had the heart to tell her. Franklin Doyle lost his license in the spring, the state board citing, among other things, sworn testimony from a former employee he'd once told nobody would ever hire again. I did not attend the hearing. I sent my father's original pen instead, briefly, on loan, so the clerk could match the handwriting in my 2-year-old buried audit file to the one I'd rebuilt from a holding cell with a golf pencil, and I asked for it back the moment the match was confirmed. Because some things you don't let go of, even to make a point. Rourke Adler pled guilty to 11 counts of fraud and was sentenced to 9 years. The Hale Foundation's endowment was made whole within a month, mostly from the sale of seized assets, and Josephine, who now ran the foundation herself, with a rigor nobody who'd known her at 24 would have predicted, sent me a handwritten note every single quarter, with the audited numbers attached, unprompted, like an offering. Priya Okafor stood beside Cassia at our small bonding ceremony in September, in the garden, at Harrow House, under a sky that had decided, for once, not to storm. In 15 years, she told the 30 guests gathered there, raising her glass, I never once saw this woman wait for anyone. Not a board vote, not a merger, not a single meeting in 15 years. She looked at me, something warm breaking through her usual brisk composure. She waited 3 months for Ren to be ready for this. I've decided that's the only fact I need about either of you. Cassia wore gray, I wore ivory, and when it came time to sign the bonding registry, I reached into my bag out of habit and found my father's pen already resting there because Cassia had slipped it in that morning without telling me, insisting the second pen she'd given me stay home, safe, for the next thing we'd need to sign together. I wrote my name. She covered my hand with hers before I'd finished the final letter, not stopping me, just there, steady, the way she'd been steady since a ballroom 2 years and a lifetime ago. Everyone else in every room missed you, she said quietly. Just for me, the old refrain worn soft now, worn kind. I never will, not once, for the rest of however long we get. That night, the house quiet, the garden lanterns still lit outside our window. I sat with her on the same balcony where a storm had once nearly undone me, and watched the last of the light go gold and then blue over the water. Her hand in mine, both our pens, hers new, mine ancient, resting together on the small table between us like proof of everything that had been added up and finally, rightly, come out true. I used to believe being unseen was simply the price of being ordinary, the tax paid by every woman whose gifts didn't announce themselves in a ballroom full of silk and easy laughter. I know better now. Being unseen was never about what I lacked. It was only ever about the rooms I hadn't found yet, and the one person patient enough to walk across a crowded floor toward the truth nobody else wanted to hear. The end. If you felt that ache of finally being noticed after years of being overlooked, you already understand why I needed to tell this one all the way through. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next, and while you're here, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest for you, the ballroom, the storm, or the courthouse steps. There's another story waiting just around the corner, and I promise you, it's just as hungry to be heard as this one was.